He saw the blood before he saw the body. Just a smear at first, dark against the dry dirt, leading from the tree line to the corner of the barn like something had dragged itself across his land. Eli froze. In all his years working this patch of the frontier, he'd seen blood before. Animal, mostly. Coyotes torn up by barbed wire, cattle mauled by cougars. But this wasn't like that. It was thicker, darker, human. He followed the trail, boots crunching over sun-baked soil, the morning air already heavy with heat. One hand stayed near the colt on his hip. Instinct more than anything. The barn loomed ahead, casting a long shadow. And just beyond it, beside the old stone well he'd dug with his father 20 years earlier, he found him. A man, young, skin the color of red earth, black hair matted with sweat. He was slumped against the well, like he'd fallen there, one hand pressed tight to a wound in his side, the other reaching, desperately, pitifully, for the wooden bucket that hung just out of reach. His lips moved without sound, his breathing shallow and ragged. Eli didn't need a doctor to know the man was dying. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Eli's hand hovered near his revolver, caught between caution and something older than fear. The man's eyes locked on his, dark and sharp despite the pain. Not pleading, not angry, just watching. Eli knew what his neighbors would say, knew what they'd do. You find a wounded Indian on your land, you don't ask questions. You don't bring him water. You put a bullet in his skull and bury him where the buzzards won't gossip. That was the frontier way. Keep your land clean. Keep your family safe. But those eyes, they didn't look like the eyes of a raider, or a murderer, or a savage. They looked like the eyes of a man who'd gone too long without kindness. Eli's jaw clenched. His hand dropped from the pistol. He stepped forward, slow and deliberate, and took hold of the well rope. The bucket groaned as it lowered into the depths, hitting water with a faint splash. He hauled it back up, sloshing and cool, and knelt beside the stranger. The man didn't move until Eli pressed the rim to his cracked lips. Then he drank, deep, desperate gulps, like a man crawling out of hell. Eli said nothing, just watched the sun rise over the edge of the hills and wondered what kind of storm he'd just invited to his door. The man drank like water, was the only thing tethering him to this world. Eli kept a steady hand on the bucket, watching each gulp disappear as the stranger's trembling fingers finally managed to clutch the wooden rim. No words passed between them. None were needed. The sound of swallowing, ragged breathing, and the slow creak of the well rope filled the stillness of the morning. It was the kind of silence Eli had grown used to on the edge of the New Mexico territory, but this time it felt heavier, like the land itself was holding its breath. When the man finally pulled away, his chest heaving, Eli saw color returning to his face. His eyes were clearer now, less clouded by pain, though still ringed in exhaustion and something else, caution. The wound in his side had soaked through his shirt, a deep red bloom that refused to stop spreading. It wasn't the kind of injury you walked away from, not without help. And Eli knew damn well that offering that help would put a target on his own back. He stared down at the stranger, trying to reconcile what he saw with what he'd been told his whole life. Indians were killers, thieves, raiders who burned homesteads and scalped travelers for sport. That's what every man at the tavern said. That's what the sheriff said. That's what the preachers said when they needed something to unify the God-fearing against. But this man didn't look like a threat. He looked like a man running from one. The stranger coughed, a wet sound, and murmured something Eli didn't catch. It might have been thanks, or maybe just breath, forced through cracked lips. Eli reached for the bucket again, lowered it, drew another pail of water, and handed it over. The man drank slower this time, more controlled. Then he leaned back against the stone well, his eyes drifting shut, not in surrender, but in relief. The kind a man feels when he realizes he might live through the night after all. Eli stood, wiped his hands on his trousers, and glanced out over the horizon. The plains stretched wide and quiet, but that meant nothing. Trouble didn't make noise until it was already breathing down your neck. He should have walked away, should have left the man there to whatever fate had already caught up with him. But something had shifted. A line had been crossed the moment he lifted that bucket. A debt owed, maybe, not just to the man, but to something bigger, older than fences and borders. Mercy. That's what this was. Not strategy, not politics. Just one man giving another a chance to breathe. Eli didn't sleep that night. He sat on the porch with a rifle across his knees, eyes fixed on the horizon. The stars hung low, sharp as nails, and the desert air had cooled just enough to raise gooseflesh on his arms. Every coyote yelp or shift in the wind made his fingers twitch on the trigger. But it wasn't fear that kept him awake. It was the weight of the unknown lying just beyond the barn. The man hadn't moved much since sunset. Eli had helped him inside the tack room, where it was dark, quiet, and smelled of old leather and dry hay. He'd cleaned the wound as best he could, poured a little whiskey over it, tore one of his own shirts into strips. The man hadn't screamed, just bit down on a scrap of cloth and let the pain wash over him like he was used to it. That said more than words ever could. By morning, the blood trail had dried, but the questions hadn't. Eli walked it again just after dawn, tracing it from the edge of the mesquite thicket where it first appeared. There were no boot prints, no horse tracks, just the drag of feet and the occasional handprint in the dust. Whoever shot this man didn't stick around to watch him die. Either they thought the job was done, or they were still close, waiting to finish it. The thought settled in Eli's gut like a lump of iron. He squatted near the trail, running his fingers through the dirt. A faint groove caught his eye, deep, thin, parallel. A rifle barrel had been dragged here, fresh, hours old at most. Eli stood and scanned the hills, his hand drifting to the revolver at his belt. Nothing moved, not yet. When he got back to the barn, the man was awake. His eyes followed Eli the way a wounded animal watches a stranger, ready to lash out, ready to run, even with no strength to do either. Eli knelt beside him again, pulled a flask of water from his pocket, and held it to his lips. The man drank slower this time, eyes never leaving Eli's. "You got a name?" Eli asked, more to break the silence than expecting an answer. The man blinked, then slowly shook his head. "Don't want to say, or can't." No reply, just a faint tightening of his jaw. Eli exhaled and looked toward the open barn door, toward the hills beyond it. Something was coming. That much he was sure of. You didn't get shot at close range and wander a half day across hard country unless you were running from hell itself. And hell had a habit of finding you when you least expected it. Dust clung to the wind now. Not natural, not right. Something was riding toward them, and it wasn't peace. The man stirred before the hoofbeats could be heard. Eli had just stepped outside with his coffee when he heard the rasp of movement behind him, the slow drag of a boot against the barn floor, followed by a low grunt of pain. He turned. The stranger was trying to sit up, his hand pressed tight against the blood-crusted bandage. Every inch of motion looked like agony, but he didn't stop, didn't even wince. He just kept pushing himself upright like he knew something Eli didn't. Eli stepped in to help, but the man raised a trembling hand. Not in gratitude, in warning. Then he pointed, past Eli, toward the distant line where the hills met the sky. His fingers curled slightly, then he sliced the air across his throat. One clean motion. Final. His eyes locked onto Eli's, with a message clearer than words. Death was coming. Eli turned toward the horizon. At first, there was nothing but heat shimmer, but after a moment, he saw it, just the faintest flicker of motion against the morning haze. A line of dust, faint, fast, riders, moving hard and direct, and headed straight for his land. The cup slipped from Eli's hand and shattered on the porch. He ran back inside the barn, breath short, heart hammering like a trapped bird. "How many?" he asked, but the man didn't answer. He'd slumped again, too weak to hold himself upright, sweat pouring from his face in sheets. Eli grabbed a fresh cloth, pressed it against the wound, but his hands were shaking now. Not from the blood. From what was coming. He darted outside, eyes scanning the landscape. The dust plume was larger now, 5, maybe 6 riders. Not soldiers, not settlers either. Too fast, too hard. Eli's mind ran through every possible name, every ranch hand, every traveling merchant, every passerby he'd ever crossed in town, and none of them fit the shape barreling toward him. This wasn't random. They were tracking something, or someone. And they were almost here. Eli ran to the water trough, splashing handfuls across the blood trail still faintly visible in the dirt. It smeared, but not enough. He grabbed a shovel and kicked dirt over the darkest spots, working fast and sloppy, sweat pouring down his back. He could still hear the hoofbeats now, louder, real, close. Back in the barn, the man tried to rise again. His lips moved. Eli leaned in. "Hide," he rasped. "No time," Eli said. But he grabbed him anyway, hoisting the stranger's arm over his shoulders. The man weighed almost nothing, bones and blood. They staggered together toward the root cellar. Before they reached the door, the man froze. His head turned, eyes wide with something Eli hadn't seen before. Not pain, not even fear. Recognition. Whoever was riding toward them, he knew them. And that meant they weren't just coming to finish a job. They were coming to silence a witness. They came over the ridge like thunder wrapped in flesh and leather. 6 riders, moving tight and fast, their horses slick with sweat and dust kicking up behind them in angry plumes. Eli stood just outside the barn, shotgun resting loose in his hands, heart knocking hard against his ribs. The stranger was hidden now, barely. Tucked in the root cellar beneath a pile of feed sacks and old canvas tarps, the air thick and still down there. He'd passed out the second Eli closed the door above him, and Eli wasn't sure if that made things better or worse. The lead rider raised a hand and slowed, and the others fanned out like a hunting party. They didn't look like men on a friendly visit. not with rifles slung low and holsters unbuttoned. One of them, a barrel-chested brute with a jagged scar across his chin, spit into the dirt as his horse trotted past Eli's chicken coop. Another scanned the tree line, like he was expecting something to leap out. The leader reined in 10 paces from Eli, dust swirling around his boots as he dismounted. His coat flared as he stepped forward, black leather, too clean for trail riding. Eli recognized the face before the name came. Sheriff Willard Kane. Not law by nature, but by reputation. He'd earned his badge not from upholding order, but by outlasting anyone who challenged it. The kind of man who never asked twice and never apologized once. "Mornin', Thatcher," Kane said, his voice smooth and sharp as broken glass. "We're looking for someone." Eli kept his stance relaxed, but inside, every muscle tensed. "Ain't seen a soul all week, Sheriff." Kane glanced around, taking in the barn, the house, the faint tracks in the dirt. His gaze lingered on the well, then shifted to the ground near it. Blood had soaked deep. Even with Eli's hasty cover-up, the stain still showed through. "That's so," Kane said, stepping past Eli like he owned the place. "Strange thing. Got a report of an injured Indian moving through this stretch. Real dangerous sort. Says he killed a U.S. officer just outside Fort Milner." Eli said nothing. Kane stopped near the well, crouched, and touched the dirt. Rubbed it between his fingers like a man testing grain. He stood, slow and deliberate. "Funny thing about blood," he said. "Hard to hide, especially when it's fresh." One of the deputies dismounted, rifle already loose in his grip. Another edged toward the barn door. Kane turned back toward Eli, his pale eyes colder than river ice. "Now, I'll ask again. You see anyone pass through here lately? Maybe bleeding? Maybe looking for water?" Eli felt the shotgun grow heavier in his hands. The wrong word would get him killed. But the truth? That might be worse. Eli didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Just stared back at Kane like he was another piece of broken fence to deal with. The shotgun stayed cradled in his arms, muzzle pointed harmlessly toward the ground. His voice, when it came, was steady, dry. "No one's come through here, Sheriff. Not in days. Been working the south fence all week." Kane tilted his head. Not in disbelief. No, Kane didn't disbelieve. He knew. Eli saw it in the curl of his lip, the way his eyes narrowed ever so slightly. Kane wasn't asking. He was waiting for Eli to confess it himself. "South fence, huh?" Kane's boots crunched as he took a slow circle around the well. "Funny thing, most folks don't do repairs during monsoon season, but I guess you always were the diligent type." Eli didn't answer. Words would only give Kane more to twist. Behind him, one of the deputies pushed open the barn door, letting in a shaft of sunlight. Eli fought the urge to react. The cellar hatch was hidden under a stack of feed sacks. Well enough, he hoped. But it wouldn't survive a thorough search. Especially not if Kane started barking orders. The sheriff stopped and looked down at the dark smear near the well. He crouched again, ran a finger along the edge of the stain, sniffed it like a hound dog. "That ain't no cow blood," he said softly. "No butcher marks either. No drag lines from a carcass, just good old-fashioned bleeding, like a man got shot and stumbled here hoping for a drink." Eli shifted his grip on the shotgun just a fraction. Not a threat, not yet, but a reminder. Kane stood. "Tell me, Eli, why would a man with nothing to hide let blood pool next to his drinking water?" Eli's jaw worked, grinding molars. "Coyote," he said finally. "Got one last night near the hen house. Dragged it here to burn it. Didn't have time yet." Kane didn't believe it. Not for a second, but he didn't push. Not yet. He looked over his shoulder at his men. "Check the barn," he said. The words hit Eli like a gut punch, but he didn't move. Couldn't. He watched as two deputies stepped inside, rifles ready, boots thudding against the plank floor. Every second stretched like a noose tightening around his neck. Down in the cellar, beneath sacks and sweat and silence, lay a man the world wanted dead. A man Eli didn't know, didn't owe, but had watered like any wounded creature that crossed his land. Kane turned back toward him, watching, waiting. The barn went quiet. Then came the creak of floorboards, the shuffle of boots. A deputy stepped out, wiping dust from his hands. "Nothing," he said. "Just tack and feed." Eli exhaled, slow, controlled. Kane stared at him a beat longer, then smiled, a thin knife-edge thing. "All right, Thatcher," he said, "but I'll be back." And Eli knew he meant it. Eli watched the riders retreat until they vanished into the shimmering haze beyond the ridge. Only when the last speck of dust settled did he let the shotgun sag against his thigh. His shirt clung to his back, soaked through. Not from heat, from the pressure of lying to a man who could kill with a grin and call it justice. He waited a long time before he went back into the barn. The cellar door creaked open, and a pair of dark eyes stared up at him from beneath the canvas, awake, alert, but not panicked. "They're gone," Eli said, "for now." The man didn't speak, just blinked slowly, his breath shallow but even. He was holding pressure against the wound again, the blood having started to seep fresh through the cloth. Eli knelt, peeled back the edge of the bandage. It was worse than he thought. Angry, red, crusted black in places. Infection was coming fast, maybe already there. He reached for a bottle of carbolic and some torn linens, but before he could begin, the man's voice stopped him. "Don't waste it!" His voice was rough, low. Each word came out like gravel scraped across a stone. "You'll need that when Kane comes back." Eli paused, surprised less by the words than by the clarity behind them. "You know the sheriff?" The man nodded once, then winced from the effort. "I know the kind." Eli poured a few drops of carbolic on the cloth anyway. "That kind nearly found you." "I let them find me," the man whispered. "Had to draw them away from the others." Eli didn't ask who the others were. Didn't ask what business had gone sideways, bad enough to put a bullet in his side. He just worked in silence, cleaning the wound as best he could, keeping his thoughts buried behind a quiet focus. "You got a name?" Eli asked finally. There was a pause. Then, Tayanita. The name settled heavy in the air. Eli had heard it before. Whispers in taverns, stories shared around fire pits. A scout, an emissary, a shadow that rode between white settlements and tribal councils like some ghost carrying peace 1 mile and war the next. "You're him," Eli said, sitting back on his heels. "You're the one that met with Colonel Whitley last spring." Tayanita's eyes flicked open again, sharp despite the pain. "Whitley's dead." Eli felt his stomach twist. "They said it was an ambush." "It was." Tayanita looked him dead in the eye. but not by my people. Outside, the wind shifted. Dust rose again on the edge of the horizon, and Eli Thatcher knew, without needing to see them, that riders were already on their way back. Only this time, they wouldn't be asking questions. Eli didn't say a word for a long time. He just sat there in the dim barn light, watching the slow rise and fall of Tyanita's chest, listening to the wind scrape against the boards like distant whispers, trying to claw their way inside. The barn smelled of sweat, leather, and blood. The kind of smell that lingered long after the danger had passed. Only this time, Eli knew the danger wasn't leaving. It was circling, getting closer. "What happened?" Eli finally asked. Tyanita's eyes drifted to the rafters, like he could see something up there the rest of the world had missed. "3 nights ago," he said, his voice no louder than a breath. "I rode out to meet Colonel Whitley. We were supposed to finalize terms, expand the treaty south, include the Comanche, the Ute, make peace something more than words scratched on paper." Eli had heard rumors of that treaty. Most folks didn't believe it would hold. Too many old scars. Too much land changing hands. But the killings had stopped, mostly. Raids had thinned. For the first time in years, settlers were building without sleeping beside their rifles. Eli had started to believe maybe, just maybe, the blood was finished. But the look in Tyanita's eyes told him otherwise. "They were waiting for us," Tyanita said. "White men, painted up like Apache, speaking just enough of our tongue to fool the scouts. They killed Whitley, shot him in the back, made it look like we'd done it." Eli's gut turned. He'd seen things during his time near the war trails. Cattlemen staging Indian raids to drive off homesteaders. Mercenaries burning farmsteads and blaming it on passing tribes. It was easier to stir fear than to maintain peace. Fear paid better, too. They wanted war, Tyanita said, and they needed a reason. Eli shook his head slowly, not in disbelief, but in dawning understanding. "And you were that reason." "I was supposed to die there," Tyanita whispered. "A bullet to the chest, blood on my hands, another dead savage. Simple story." "But you didn't die," Eli said. Tyanita turned to look at him then. Really looked. Number I crawled for 2 days. No food, no water. Just dust and blood, and the memory of Whitley's face when he realized who betrayed him. "Who was it?" Tyanita's jaw clenched. "Kane's name was on the dispatch. He was never supposed to be there. But he was, watching, waiting, and when the shots rang out, he didn't lift a finger." Eli stood, heart pounding. It all made sense now. The urgency, the lie at the well, the cold calculation behind Kane's visit. The sheriff wasn't chasing a fugitive. He was covering up a murder. And Eli had just taken the one man alive who could burn it all down and hidden him under his own roof. The sun crept higher, but it brought no warmth. Eli stood just outside the barn, staring toward the hills where the riders had vanished. His coffee had gone cold in his hand. He hadn't taken a sip, not since Tyanita's words dug their way into his bones like splinters. Kane hadn't just shown up on a hunch. He was tying up loose ends, silencing the only witness to a crime that could split the territory in two. Behind him, Tyanita stirred, groaning softly as he tried to sit upright. Eli set the tin cup down and stepped back inside. "You shouldn't move." "I can't stay still." His breath was shallow again, pain creeping back into every word. Eli helped ease him upright against a post, tucking a folded blanket behind his back. Tyanita's skin was pale beneath the sweat, but his eyes hadn't dulled. If anything, they burned brighter. "They'll come again," he said. "Sooner than you think." Eli nodded. "And next time, they won't be asking questions." Tyanita pulled something from his belt, slow, deliberate, a folded square of paper, stained deep with blood at the edges. He held it out with a trembling hand. "Colonel Whitley wrote this, night before he died. Told me to deliver it to Fort San Marcos if anything went wrong." Eli unfolded the paper. The handwriting was messy, rushed, but the meaning was clear. Names, locations, dates, references to weapon shipments, land deals, payments disguised as scouting contracts. Kane's name was there, twice. So was a judge, a merchant, a railroad man Eli recognized from church picnics. It was enough to bury them all. Tyanita closed his eyes. "That's why they want me dead. Not because I'm Apache. Not because of the treaty. Because I know who profits from keeping this land soaked in blood." Outside, the wind picked up. A loose shutter banged against the barn wall like a warning shot. Eli folded the paper, slipped it inside his coat. "If this gets out, it'll start something worse than war." Tyanita didn't flinch. "Maybe, or maybe it'll end what's already been raging in silence." From the front gate came a shout. Eli's heart jumped. He moved to the door and peeked out. Kane was back, this time with twice as many men. Tyanita sat up straighter, despite the wound. "They're not here to talk." Eli's grip tightened on his rifle. "Then neither are we." And in that quiet moment between truth and violence, Eli knew something had shifted. He wasn't just harboring a fugitive anymore. He was choosing a side. The riders didn't come at a gallop this time. They moved with grim purpose, slow and wide, spreading out like a net across the front of Eli's land. 12 now, not 6. A few familiar faces from town, deputies, hired hands, a pair of men who'd once asked to buy his property and hadn't liked being told no. At their center rode Sheriff Kane, face carved from stone, hat pulled low, coat unbuttoned just enough to show the revolver at his side. Eli stepped out onto the porch, rifle resting across his arms, calm, steady. But inside, his thoughts tumbled like river rocks. Behind him, Tyanita crouched near the root cellar door, breath shallow, hand pressed to his ribs. He wasn't strong enough to run, maybe not even to stand, but his eyes never wavered. Kane rode close, stopped just short of the porch steps. Dust swirled between them. "Didn't expect to be back so soon," Kane said, voice easy as molasses. "But orders change." Eli said nothing. Kane looked around. "Had word from Fort Milner. Turns out our Apache friend is wanted for more than just murder. Treason, too. Assassination plot. Real dangerous sort." Eli's silence was answer enough. Kane's eyes narrowed. "Mind if we look around again?" "You already did. This time, we'll be more thorough." One of the men behind Kane dismounted, rifle at the ready. Another followed. They headed for the barn. Eli raised his voice just enough to carry. "You looking for justice, or you looking to finish what you started?" Kane's smile didn't reach his eyes. "I don't follow." "I think you do." Eli's hand moved slightly on the rifle. "That ambush on Colonel Whitley wasn't no Apache raid. That was men like you, dressing up the truth in war paint. Kane's jaw tightened. From inside the barn came a thump, a shout, a scuffle of boots. Then silence. Eli turned, heart dropping. But before he could move, the barn door swung wide and one of the deputies emerged, holding something above his head. A letter, stained, torn, but intact. He handed it to Kane. Kane unfolded it, eyes scanning quickly. The blood drained from his face. Eli watched the sheriff go pale, his hands stiffening at the corners of the page. For a moment, the man said nothing, just stared at the ink like it had come alive. "You recognize it?" Eli asked. Kane didn't respond, not directly. He folded the letter, slid it into his coat. "That letter's nothing but lies." Tyanita stepped out from the barn, leaning hard on the doorframe, blood soaking fresh through his shirt. "It's your handwriting at the bottom," he said, voice calm. "Your seal. Colonel Whitley trusted me with it. That's why you wanted me dead." Kane reached for his gun. Eli raised his rifle. And the air between them cracked with the weight of truth laid bare. The world seemed to hold its breath. Kane's hand froze on the grip of his revolver. Eli's rifle was leveled, not shaking, not wavering, aimed straight at the sheriff's chest. Behind them, the deputies stood in a loose half-circle, some gripping their rifles, others suddenly unsure whether they should. The dust that hung in the air glittered in the sunlight like ash waiting to settle. "You shoot me," Kane said, low and dangerous, "and they'll hang you before sundown." Eli didn't blink. "You fire on a wounded man and bury the only copy of that letter, and this territory burns before the month's out." Tyanita leaned against the barn door, his breath shallow but steady. "Tell them," he said, looking straight at the deputies. "Tell them what Colonel Whitley was trying to do. Tell them what Kane's men did." Kane's eyes flicked to his left. "You boys best not be listening to—" "That's enough," said one of the deputies. He stepped forward. Young, maybe 22, clean-shaven, nervous hands but steady eyes. "We've been following you for 3 years, Sheriff. Through burned camps, ghost trails, bodies buried in shallow graves. We kept telling ourselves there was a reason, that you were protecting the townsfolk." Kane turned slowly. "Bradley." Bradley didn't flinch. "But we never saw proof. Until now." Another deputy spoke. "Those rifles that went missing last fall? The ones supposedly stolen by raiders?" He looked at the others. "I saw them 2 weeks later, in the back of a wagon heading east, guarded by men wearing badges." Kane's face was turning red, veins thick on his neck. "You calling me a traitor?" "You called yourself that," Eli said, "when you let Whitley die, and tried to blame it on a man who came to make peace." One by one, the deputies began to shift, hands falling away from weapons, eyes turning not toward their leader, but toward each other. Unease was turning into resolve. Kane's last loyal man, a grizzled brute named Murdoch, stepped forward. "You all gonna betray your own? Side with a savage?" Tyanita didn't move. He just looked at Murdoch and said, "I came to sign peace, not start war, but I'll die if I have to." Bradley drew his weapon and pointed it at Kane. "Nobody's dying today, not unless you make it happen." More rifles were raised, not toward the barn, toward Kane. Eli watched it all unfold with a hollow thud in his chest. Not relief, not yet. Because cornered men don't confess. They lash out. Cain's hand twitched. "Don't," Eli warned. But there was something wild in Cain's eyes now. Something that said he didn't care if he burned so long as he brought others with him. And for the first time, Eli truly believed he was looking at a man who would rather kill the truth than live with it. Cain's hand stayed near his pistol, fingers twitching like a man itching to settle a score with God himself. Around him, the deputies had formed a loose ring, weapons drawn but unsteady, unsure if this was a standoff or a mutiny. The only thing keeping bullets from flying was the brittle silence stretched tight between them. Tyanita stood straighter, blood still wet on his side, but his eyes calm, too calm. He looked at Cain the way you might look at a fire that's already burned through the walls of your house. Nothing left to fear. Then, without warning, he began to sing. It wasn't loud, not a battle cry, just a low, mournful chant in Apache, slow and rhythmic, like the turning of the earth. The melody slipped through the tension, like wind through tall grass, stirring something ancient. The words meant nothing to the deputies, nothing to Eli, but the feeling behind them, the weight of them, settled in everyone's chest. Cain flinched, like the sound touched something raw inside him. "What the hell is that?" he snapped. Tyanita kept singing, eyes on the horizon now. Eli felt it before he heard it. The faintest tremor in the earth beneath his boots. Not loud, not obvious, but steady, like thunder still too far to see. Then another, closer. The sound of many hoofbeats, far more than 12. Cain heard it next. His head snapped to the north, where the ridge cut the sky clean. The tremor grew louder, rising with the song. Bradley lowered his rifle a fraction. "Is that—" Eli already knew the answer. They were coming. Dozens of riders, maybe more, cresting the distant hills in silence. Dark shapes against the sun, too many to count. They rode in formation, tight, precise, not charging, not attacking, but moving like a tide that could swallow the world whole if it chose to. Tyanita's voice fell quiet. Eli stepped forward, his own voice steady. He wasn't just calling for peace. Cain turned, face pale now. He was summoning them. Tyanita looked at the sheriff. "You wanted the Apache dead. You thought if I died quietly, the treaty would die with me." The first line of warriors reached the base of the hill, dust curling around their horses' legs like smoke from a fire. "But I didn't die," Tyanita said, "and I wasn't alone." Cain drew his pistol. The deputies all moved at once, rifles raised, eyes wide with fear and uncertainty. Not at the Apache, at their own sheriff. "You aim that gun," Bradley said, "and you'll start a war we can't stop." Cain's eyes darted between them, breath coming fast. He saw it too now, the end of the game. The song, the silence, the storm coming down the hill. Eli stepped between Cain and Tyanita. No rifle, no threat. Just a man who'd chosen his side. "We gave him water," Eli said, "and now the land remembers." The hoofbeats thundered closer, and for the first time, Sheriff Cain looked truly afraid. They came over the ridge like ghosts summoned from another world. 50 Apache warriors riding in silent formation, their horses moving as one across the golden plain. Not a war cry among them, no raised weapons, no chaos, just purpose, controlled, powerful. Their war paint shimmered in the morning sun, lines of black and red that caught the light like blood etched in ceremony. At their head rode an old man draped in furs and eagle feathers, his face carved by years and wind, but his posture straight as a rifle barrel. He didn't need to shout. His presence spoke louder than thunder. Eli had never seen a man carry himself like that. Tyanita straightened as they approached, and despite the pain tightening his jaw, a flicker of something crossed his face, something close to reverence. "My father," he said quietly. The circle of deputies began to break, inching back as the Apache warriors spread out and surrounded the yard. They made no move toward violence, but the message was clear. This was no longer Kane's ground. Sheriff Kane stepped back, the pistol still hanging loose in his hand, his face pale and twitching with indecision. His bravado was gone, drained out by the sheer inevitability of what was happening. He opened his mouth, but nothing came. The old chief dismounted and walked slowly toward the barn, not rushed, not cautious, like he was reclaiming land that had always been his. Every warrior watched in silence, eyes sharp beneath painted brows. The chief stopped in front of Tyanita. He placed a weathered hand on his son's shoulder and looked down at the blood staining his shirt. His fingers hovered over the wound, checking, assessing. He spoke in Apache, soft but firm. Tyanita responded, voice low. Eli didn't understand the words, but he understood the rhythm. The truth was being passed between them. The old man turned to face the rest. He spoke English with a deep, measured voice. "I am Nantan, elder of the White Rock people. My son came to make peace. He was betrayed." His gaze moved slowly, finally resting on Kane. Sheriff Willard Kane rode with the men who painted their faces in lies, who killed a man of the U.S. Army and blamed my people to profit from fire. Kane's fingers clenched around his pistol. "You have no proof," he spat. But his voice cracked. The chief raised his hand. One of the warriors rode forward and dismounted, carrying a leather satchel. From it, he pulled a bundle of papers, letters, maps, logs. Eli saw Kane's signature on one, without even needing to read the rest. The chief's eyes never left Kane's. Proof! The circle tightened. Kane took one step back. The old man didn't move. "You tried to kill the treaty," he said. "Now you stand alone." And for the first time in all his years of command, Kane had no one behind him. Kane looked around for allies and found none. His men, once loyal, once eager to follow his orders without question, now stood frozen in place, rifles lowered, eyes uncertain. Even Murdoch, the last of his bulldogs, wasn't moving. The weight of the papers in the Apache warriors' hands had shattered something in them all. The illusion, the lie they'd clung to, that Kane was justice, that Kane stood for law. Now, he looked like what he truly was, a man cornered. "You can't believe them," Kane growled, his voice rising with panic. "They're savages. They lie. They kill. This is theater, stage dressing to make you turn against your own." Bradley stepped forward, rifle still in hand. "Then explain the shipment logs with your name. Explain the bank drafts, the map showing those ambush points. You think we didn't check your office while you were out chasing ghosts?" Kane's mouth opened, closed. His hand hovered near his pistol, like it was the only truth he had left. Tyanita stepped forward, supported by his father. Blood still soaked his side, but his voice rang clear. You didn't just try to kill a man. You tried to kill peace. Cain's eyes snapped to him, blazing. You think peace was ever real? Look around. This land doesn't want it. The settlers want safety. Your people want revenge. And men like me, we just want to survive the fire both sides keep feeding. You didn't survive it, Eli said. You built it. Cain turned then, wild-eyed, and pointed his pistol, not at the chief, not at Tyanita, but at Eli. You're just a rancher, he hissed. What the hell do you know about any of this? Eli raised his rifle, but didn't fire. His voice was steady. I know what a dying man looks like when he asks for water, and I know what kind of man turns that into a death sentence. For a moment, it looked like Cain would pull the trigger. Then Bradley moved again. So did two others. All rifles aimed straight at their sheriff. Drop it, Bradley said. Cain hesitated. His hand shook. You think they'll spare you? Cain barked. They'll gut you the second you lower your guard. They spared you, said Tyanita, voice cold, and still, you came here to kill. The tension snapped. Cain screamed and swung the pistol toward the chief, finger tightening. But the shot never came. Eli tackled him from behind, both men crashing into the dust. The revolver skidded across the ground and stopped inches from the chief's feet. Cain lay on his back, gasping, pinned under Eli's knee. The fight was gone now. All that remained was the stink of desperation and the sound of his shallow, wheezing breath. The Apache said nothing. Neither did the deputies. They didn't have to. Justice had arrived. And Cain was finally alone in the silence he had earned. The silence after the scuffle was the kind that settled into a man's bones. Cain didn't resist as Eli stood and stepped back, his coat caked in dust, hands still clenched from the adrenaline. The sheriff lay there in the dirt like a man who couldn't quite believe it was over. But it was. His revolver lay 10 feet away, untouched. No one moved to return it. Deputy Bradley approached, slow and careful, rifle lowered but ready. He pulled a pair of iron cuffs from his belt. Eli hadn't even known he carried them, and snapped them over Cain's wrists with the finality of a judge's gavel. You're under arrest, Bradley said, voice steady despite the weight of the moment. For conspiracy, corruption, and attempted murder. Cain didn't look at him, didn't look at anyone. Just stared up at the empty sky, jaw clenched, chest rising and falling like a man trying to breathe underwater. Tyanita had fallen back against the side of the barn, spent but alive. His father knelt beside him, pressing a cool cloth to his forehead. The old chief murmured something low in Apache, and Tyanita managed a nod. Then the chief turned to Eli. He crossed the yard with the slow grace of a man carrying more years than most men live, his feathers stirring in the wind, his eyes dark and unreadable. Eli met him halfway, unsure whether to speak or stand silent. He didn't get the chance to choose. The chief placed both hands on Eli's shoulders, not roughly, not delicately, with ceremony. He spoke in Apache, and this time Tyanita translated from behind him, his voice quiet but clear. He says you gave life to a dying man, that you chose mercy when others chose hate, that in our ways such a deed makes you kin. Eli blinked, unsure how to answer. The wind tugged at his coat. Dust circled their boots. Tyanita's voice softened. He says, you are brother now. The words landed heavier than Eli expected. not just because of what they meant, but because he knew what they cost. These people had every reason not to trust a white man, every reason to keep their circle closed, and yet here they stood, offering him something no one in his own town ever had. Respect, not for wealth, not for blood, but for choice. The chief removed a gourd from the satchel slung over his shoulder, hand-carved, beaded, worn smooth by time. He placed it in Eli's hands like a sacred thing. "For water," Tyanita said. "The first gift." Eli nodded, throat tight. The Apache dismounted one by one, circling Eli in silence. Each man reached out, not to shake, not to salute, but to touch his hand. A gesture older than language, a rite, a recognition. And by the time the last warrior passed, Eli Thatcher was no longer just a rancher. He was family. They left with the morning sun at their backs. The Apache rode in silence, formation unbroken, flanking Tyanita and his father as they crossed the open plain. No cheers, no farewells, just the steady rhythm of hooves against dry earth and the soft jingle of saddles. It wasn't a victory march. It was something deeper, a return, a restoration of balance that had been nearly lost to greed and bullets. Eli stood at the edge of his porch, the ceremonial water gourd still clutched in his hands. He watched them vanish over the ridge, dust curling behind them, like smoke from a fire finally dying down. Tyanita had looked back once, only once. But in that glance, there had been something Eli couldn't forget. Gratitude, not just for saving his life, but for believing it was worth saving. Kane and Murdoch were bound to the wagon, guarded by Bradley and the other deputies, who'd once called them brother. Neither man spoke. Kane's face was a knot of bruises and bitterness, his mouth set in a hard line of rage he could no longer voice. Murdoch just stared at the ground. The ride back to town would be slow, quiet, heavy with shame. Eli didn't plan to follow. He had repairs to make, fields to till, and a world to reckon with. The gourd sat on the table inside his cabin now, resting beside the old ledger where he kept his crop notes. He didn't dare clean it, didn't dare polish the beads or wipe away the dust. It wasn't a trinket. It was a marker, a line in time. News spread fast. Within a week, folks in town stopped talking about the murderous Apache fugitive and started whispering about the papers found on Kane, the ledgers, the missing army rifles, the payouts, the forged warrants. Everything Tyanita and Whitley had tried to stop was laid bare. The trial came swift. Kane and Murdoch were convicted of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, and treason. Kane didn't beg. He didn't even speak. Some said it was pride. Eli figured it was something closer to rot. The treaty was not only upheld, it was expanded. With the evidence brought forward, and Tyanita's return, the southern tribes were brought into the agreement. Skirmishes stopped. Trade lines opened. And for the first time in a long while, settlers and warriors sat at the same fire. They called it peace. But Eli knew better. It wasn't peace that had come to the frontier that day. It was mercy. One man giving another a chance to drink. A gesture as old as fire, as simple as life. And somehow, that had been enough to pull a whole territory back from the brink. Eli never spoke much about what happened. But every time he drew water from that well, he thought about the man crumpled beside it. And every time he drank, he remembered. Sometimes the world doesn't change with bullets or banners. Sometimes it starts with just a cup of water and the courage to offer it.